The Roman Empire, one of history's greatest civilizations, lasted for over 1,000 years. But how did it fall? Well, the last thing that you need to know is that Rome didn't fall overnight. Rather, it was a slow decline that occurred over several centuries. And this decline can be divided into four main factors. Factor? No! 1. Overexpansion. At its greatest extent, the Roman Empire stretched from Britain to North Africa and from Spain to the Middle East. This vast empire required a massive army to defend it. And by the 3rd century AD, the Roman military was overstretched and exhausted. As a result, the empire began to lose its strength and power. For example, in 296, the Franks sacked Rome. And just a few years later, the Visigoths invaded Italy. So it was clear that Rome was no longer the invincible power that it once was. To make matters worse, overexpansion also meant that Rome had to collect more taxes from its citizens to fund its military. But the problem was that the amount of tax that people had to pay was completely unsustainable. Like at this point, the average Roman had to pay about 1/8 of their income to the state, which is a higher tax rate than any modern developed country today. And the worst part is that most of these taxes weren't even going towards public services or infrastructure. Rather, they were going directly into the pockets of corrupt Roman elites and officials. So eventually, the burden became too great, and the empire started to collapse under the weight of its own corruption. Factor 2. Economic crisis. The Roman economy was a slave-based economy, which meant that it was highly dependent on the institution of slavery. However, as the empire expanded, the cost of acquiring slaves became increasingly expensive, and this led to a shortage of labor, which resulted in fewer goods being produced and an economic slowdown. Also, during the 3rd century, Rome experienced a series of natural disasters, including earthquakes, floods, and volcanic eruptions, which devastated the economy and caused widespread famine. To make matters worse, during this period, there was a significant decline in trade with Asia due to the rise of the Sasanian Empire. They disrupted the Silk Road and cut off Rome's access to valuable goods from the east. All of this resulted in a sharp decline in living standards for ordinary Romans. And those who suffered the most were the poor and the middle class, who were already struggling under the weight of heavy taxes. Factor 3. Political instability. Throughout its history, Rome had been plagued by political instability and corruption, and this became especially acute during the 3rd century, a period known as the crisis of the 3rd century. During this time, there was a rapid succession of emperors, many of whom were killed or deposed, and this instability created a climate of fear and uncertainty that made it difficult for Rome to function effectively. Also, as the empire grew, it became increasingly difficult to govern over such a vast area, and this led to a growing gap between the rulers and the ruled. The result was a deep sense of alienation among the populace who felt increasingly disconnected from their government. By the 4th century, the empire was being held together by a series of personal unions between various Germanic chieftains and the Roman emperors. But these uneasy alliances couldn't last forever. And that brings us to our 4th factor, invasions by Germanic tribes. Throughout the later empire, Rome had relied on a series of buffer states to protect its borders. But during the 4th century, these buffer states began to collapse, which allowed various Germanic tribes to pour into the empire. The first major invasion came in 376 when the Visigoths crossed the Rhine and settled in Pannonia. They were followed a few years later by the Vandals, who settled in the province of Africa. Both tribes were initially welcomed by Rome as mercenaries, but soon became a threat to the empire. In 410, the Visigoths sacked Rome, and in 455, the Vandals sacked it as well. So it was clear that Rome was no longer safe, not even its own soil. With that, the Western Roman Empire collapsed in 476, marking the end of an era. But the story doesn't end here. While the western half of the empire was crumbling, the eastern half, also known as the Byzantine Empire, continued to thrive for another 1,000 years. So that's what happened. The fall of the Roman Empire. Thanks for watching.